Okay. Genealogy is not about studying dead people. It's about understanding our ancestors and those who contributed to our gene pool, the lives they led, and how they contribute to the person that each of us is today. Genealogists have a special calling, a calling that is very honored in one of the cultures of our First Nations people. We are storytellers that bring the past to life and to help us better understand who we are, what we're made of, and what we're called to do. The personal accomplishments of today's speaker are too numerous to mention here. But as a 23-year veteran of the Canadian military, a former chief of the Algonquin First Nation at Pikwakanagan, a person awarded a King Charles III Coronation Medal in 2025 by the Governor General of Canada, Wendy's story is woven into Canadian history. Her father and 5 of his brothers fought in World War II. 4 of her great uncles enlisted in the First World War. Our speaker's military service history goes back 6 generations. Her paternal great-grandfather, times 6, was an Algonquin Grand Chief who fought alongside the British in the War of 1812. Please join me today in welcoming Wendy Jocko.
Thank you very much, Larry, for that introduction. And Kadokwe Nadishnikos, Megasenito Dem Pikwakanagan Natonchiba. As Larry just mentioned, my name is Wendy Jocko. My clan is Eagle, and I live currently in the community of Pikwakanagan, which is roughly 30 minutes from here. It's quite an interesting morning. I just found out that I'm standing in the old cottage hospital, and I was born in the newer cottage hospital in 1960, February the 2nd, so that makes me 66 years old. And I'm really pleased to be here with you this morning. So a lot of the history that I'm going to be talking about today, I did get a lot of this history from Joan Holmes, who's actually a genealogist and an anthropologist. And she's traced my family tree back to 1783 to the first chief, Chief Wambolak. And also I'm relying on stories from my mother and my father, and that's to do with our family background. So I'll just flick it over to the next slide. So my story begins across 2 continents, weaving together the rugged landscapes of Scotland and the vast territories of Algonquin territory. Just to let you know, the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan Reserve was established in 1873. It was called Golden Lake Indian Band number 39 at the time of its establishment. Unfortunately, I did not bring the flag with me today. It completely slipped my mind, but if you happen to go on the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan First Nation site, you'll see that our flag is made up of a circle, which represents Pikwakanagan always going forward, and the circle of life. There's a feather and a plume, and that represents our culture. You'll notice that there's a black bear in the flag itself, and that represents the very first chief of Pikwakanagan, which was Inius Makwa. So that's why we have the flag depicted in that way, and it was designed by artist Tony Amicons. So this is a story of resilience and love and bridging 2 cultures that were not always ready to embrace such unions. Just to let you know a little bit about my mother, there she is. My mother, her name is Williamina Bar Mackay. She was born on the 30th November in 1924 in Cowdenbeath, Scotland, which is a coal mining town in Fife. She was named after her own father. His name was William Bar Mackay, and he was a chauffeur to a lord and her mother, her name was Margaret Aiken Marshall. Unfortunately, her life was marked with hardship and separation, and at the tender age of 4, she was placed in the Dean Orphanage in Edinburgh, where she would spend the next 8 years of her childhood. So unfortunately, my mother's parents were separated, and that was one of the major reasons that she and her sister, Betty, or Elizabeth as she was called, was placed in the Dean Orphanage, and their brother James, he was placed in the workhouse. So the Dean Orphanage was established in 1733 and was known for its strict regime, but it also provided structure and education to children who had nowhere else to turn, or sadly for those who were unwanted. And it is actually now the Dean Art Gallery. And I actually used to live in Scotland myself for 10 years, and I did go and visit the art gallery, and I stood in my mother's bed space, you know, just for sentimental reasons. I went there just to see where my mother lived. It's a very cold, stone building, and it's actually the model, unfortunately, believe it or not, of the residential schools that were established here in Canada for Indigenous people. So at the age of 12, my mother, Wilhelmina, she returned to live with her father, but the reunion was short-lived. Her father lived in a place called Black Ness, which is also in Fife. When she was 15, he handed her a £5 note and sent her out in service. So in service, I don't know if you've ever seen the show called Downton Abbey. She became a table maid in a lord's house in a place called Dunbar, which is a coastal town in East Lothian in Scotland. And it was not uncommon for young women of her class and circumstances to be put into domestic service, and it was often seen as the only viable option for survival. However, my mother was made of sterner stuff, and when the war broke out in 1939, she actually jumped out the window when she was 17, and she ran away from the Lord's house, and she actually joined the Scottish Women's Land Army. So she ran away from her position, as I mentioned, by jumping out of the window, and she joined the Scottish Women's Land Army. And that was a civilian organization created during the World Wars to work in agriculture, which replaced men who had gone off to fight. And I remember her telling me that when she was in her uniform, she was running up the stairs to the Edinburgh Hotel, and she met David Niven. I don't know if you know who David Niven is, but he was a movie star, and my mother was actually quite a pretty girl, as you saw in the previous poster of her, and he actually invited her out to dinner. So he was quite a debonair leading man in many Hollywood classic films, and she did say that he was quite a gentleman, and so that was one of her tall tales when she joined the Land Army. So she was posted to Inverness, which is in the Scottish Highlands, where she would work on the land and unknowingly meet the man who would become my father. So my dad, Leo Alexander Jocko, he was born February the 19th, 1919. I always like that date. It's quite easy to remember. Somewhere in Algonquin territory, I don't know exactly where he was born. On his military papers, there's an indication of Brudenell. So, like I said, I don't know where he was born, but anyway, we'll pinpoint it to say Brudenell. So he was an Indigenous member and of proud Algonquin people with deep roots to the land that stretches across what we now know as Ontario and Quebec. He is the son of, I don't know if I should be on the next slide, just so you can see a picture of him. There he is. So he's the son of Paul Jocko, and Paul Jocko was known as Black Paul. What reason, I don't know, where the word black came in. Anyway, and his mother was Mary LaValle. So Black Paul was married 4 times. His first wife, her name was Angeline Milnes. He had 4 children to Angeline. Milnes is also Mines. The names back in those days, sometimes people didn't know how to spell those names, but it's actually Mines. And they had 4 children. Unfortunately, she must have passed away because then he married another lady named Elizabeth Benway or Benoit. And to her, he had 5 children. Pardon me, he didn't have the children to Angeline, it was to Elizabeth. And then she died, and then Angelique Phil de Grand came into the picture. And apparently this lady was quite mean to the children, so he divorced her. So he was looking for a housekeeper, and my granny, Mary Lavalley, lived in the Combermere Brudenell area. You have to appreciate back in those days, people followed the rivers, you know, and to the summer and the winter hunting ground. So they were either up in Bancroft or they'd be in Brudenell or Combermere, you know, but always in an area where all the Algonquin people, we all knew where each other was. So he basically, you know, advertised for a housekeeper. So my granny came in to take care of the children and ended up marrying Black Paul and having 10 children. So, you know, that's how my father came into the picture. So unfortunately, my dad died at the Sunnybrook Hospital, which is a veterans hospital in Toronto, on the 2nd of March, 1983, and he was only 64 years old. So like many young Indigenous men of his generation, he answered the call of duty. Can I tell which slide this is? Go back one. Yeah. He answered the call of duty, and he joined the war in 1939. So he enlisted in the Forestry Corps, and that was a unit that played a crucial role in the war effort by providing timber for construction, fuel, and countless military necessities. So the Canadian Forestry Corps operated in various theaters of war, and my father's unit was number 12 Company and was posted to Scotland, specifically to Inverness, where thousands of Canadian servicemen were stationed. So it was there in the Highland capital that my parents' paths would cross. So a Scottish woman from a mining town and an Algonquin man from the forests of Canada, 2 people from vastly different worlds brought together under the circumstances of war. There we go. So after the war ended, my mother made a difficult decision to leave Scotland and cross the Atlantic with my oldest brother, Sandy, to join my father in Canada. So with the help of the Red Cross, she made her way across to Canada, landing in Halifax at Pier 21 and landed in the month of February. And that's kind of significant, that month in itself. As you know, it's really cold here in Canada. And when I was living in Scotland, her sister said, "Oh yes, I remember when your mother was going off to Canada. She had a beautiful tweed suit on." Suit! And no coat, right? Just a suit. And, you know, she says, "Oh, I'm going to knock them dead when I get into Canada." Well, she probably almost died herself when she felt how cold it was. So from Halifax, she took a train to Wilno, Ontario, where my father met her as she got off the train. And actually, just so everybody knows in the audience and those online, in the audience, I have first cousins and I have second cousins sitting here. And always remember Ernie, your mom, saying that people from Pikwakanagan or Golden Lake, as it was known at the time, they all went to Wilno so they could see who my dad's bride was. Yeah. So it was a journey filled with hope, but also uncertainty. So the Canada she arrived to was not the Scotland that she had left behind. And as I mentioned, February is the coldest month here in Canada. And so the culture, the landscape, and the very rhythm of life was really different. And the challenges of being in an interracial relationship in the 1940s were immense. So from Wilno Station, they made their way to Madawaska, and there was so much snow that the taxi driver basically refused to drag her trunks into the house because, of course, there was too much snow. So they had to pull her trunk all the way to the house. And unfortunately, the cultural differences proved to be too overwhelming at first. So my mom didn't stay with my father. She left 3 months after because, unfortunately, my Granny Jocko, refused to speak English. She only spoke Algonquin with her sons. It must have been horrendous. There was no heat, only the wood stove. There was no lights, just the coal oil lanterns. There was the outhouse. And how do you get the water when you have, a child that you're trying to take care of? So it was slightly unwelcoming for my mother. So she moved from Madawaska to Ottawa, where she found work at the prestigious Chateau Laurier Hotel. And actually, I've just spent the week in Ottawa at the Assembly of First Nation Assembly Annual General Meeting. And yesterday, actually, I was sitting in front of the hotel just reminiscing, what it must have been like to work there. Because in those days, she was a chambermaid, which is one of the ladies that goes around and, tidies up the room. And they actually used to have to live at the top of the hotel. That's the way it was in those days at the Chateau Laurier. So she had to put my oldest brother out, not to be adopted, but to be cared for by a family. And she got to see him on the weekend. So that was kind of sad, really, that you weren't basically permitted in those days, if you were, a mom to a working person, to have your babysitting arrangements a little bit more closer to home. So for 10 years, she built her life for herself and Sandy in Canada's capital, which is Ottawa, which is certainly far from her Scottish roots and the Algonquin territories that were my father's home. So fate, however, had other plans, and by pure chance, this is where Red Paul comes into the equation. So the reason I say Red Paul, because there's Black Paul and there's Red Paul. Red Paul also married my grandmother when Black Paul passed away. And Ernie McPhee here is Red Paul's grandson, sitting in the audience. And I don't obviously know that the people online can see Ernie, but there he is in the flesh. But anyway, Red Paul happened to see my mother in Ottawa at a candy store, and they conversed. And then, of course, when Red Paul went back to Madawaska, he told my dad, they called my mother Winnie. They didn't call her Wilhelmina. And so they, my father was in Ottawa, of course, the very next week, hunting my mother down and asking her to get back together. And of course they did. And they had four more children, which is myself, my older sister, Leona, Mark, and Paul. And actually, my name is Wendy Ann with an E, but my sister, her name is Leona Mary, and we were actually named after Ernie's mom. So you see, Leona Mary, and my name, Wendy Ann. So Mary Ann Jocko. That's how my mother gave us our name. So I don't know if you ever knew that, but that's the story there, Ernie. So in fact, I am a war baby and a living testament to the love that survived separation, cultural differences, and the prejudices of the time, actually coming from both sides of the fence, clearly. So during a wartime, many Canadian soldiers married foreign women who became known as war brides and were later brought to Canada with government assistance. So the Second World War saw most significant numbers of these marriages, with tens of thousands of women, primarily from Britain, marrying Canadian servicemen and immigrating to Canada after the war. The Canadian government facilitated this migration, providing transportation and making war brides Canadian citizens, while local communities often welcomed them, which was very nice. The war brides and their families had a lasting impact on Canadian society and culture. So tragically, my father died young at the age of 64, as I mentioned, and his passing left a void, but my mother's story did not end there. She later married Arthur Rosette, who was another Indigenous man, and Art came from the reserve called Sandy Bay in Manitoba. So he was a Cree. So together they spent the rest of their lives as partners facing the world side by side. So interracial couples were not readily accepted in those days, and my mother and Arthur, like my mother and father before them, experienced racism and discrimination, unfortunately. And so did we children, and we grew up navigating two worlds, neither of which always welcomed us fully. Yet, we carried forward the strength and the resilience of both our Scottish and Indigenous heritages. So my mother and Arthur visited Scotland on several occasions, reconnecting with the land of her birth. I did live in Scotland myself for 10 years, which I trained as a funeral director and an embalmer, which certainly was a very rewarding career. So living in Scotland allowed me to explore my mother's roots more deeply, to walk the streets of Cowdenbeath and Edinburgh, and to understand the world that has shaped her. So my story is not unique. Throughout Canadian history, there have been countless unions between Indigenous people and those from the British Isles. These relationships often defined social norms and challenged the prejudices of their time. Many Canadian soldiers, including First Nation members, were stationed and trained in various parts of the UK, including Scotland, and before participating in the Normandy landings and subsequent campaigns. The presence of thousands of Canadian soldiers in Scotland led to significant social interaction, including many cases of war brides, where British and European women, including many from Scotland, married Allied soldiers and moved to Canada after the war, like my mother. So here's a story of one of the most famous examples of such a union, and that is of Grey Owl and his wife, Anahario. So Grey Owl was born Archibald Delaney in Hastings, England in 1888. He immigrated to Canada as a young man and immersed himself so completely into Indigenous culture that he eventually presented himself as a man of mixed Indigenous heritage. So technically, he was the first pretendian. He immigrated to North America at the age of 17 and became a well-known conservationist and a writer in the 1930s. He falsely claimed to be of mixed heritage and Scottish heritage to make his conservation message resonate with his audience. He lived in the Ojibwe with the Ojibwe people in Northern Ontario, learning their ways and adopting the name Grey Owl. I can't really pronounce his Anishinaabe name, but anyway, it's similar to cuckoo or kohoko, because that's how we pronounce the word owl in Algonquin. Cuckoo originally, but kohoko laterally, because people made fun of the word cuckoo. So he claimed to be the son of a Scotsman and an Apache woman, a story that he used to give his views more weight with the public. If you ever seen a movie about him, the actor at the time was Pierce Bronson, and it was a great movie. And it was so funny in one of the scenes that when the chiefs all got together, Grey Owl was there, and they took one look at him and they started laughing because they clearly could see he was not an Indigenous person, but they let him join in the events anyway. So Archie served in World War I. He was wounded and then returned to Canada. He also became a trapper, a writer, and one of the earliest conservationists in North America. So in 1925, Archibald met Gertrude Bernard, an Iroquois woman from the Mattawa region of Quebec, who went by the name of Anahario. And she was also known as Pony in some accounts. She was 19 and he was 37. But you know what? That was not uncommon for the time or throughout history. As I mentioned, my granny, she was actually only 17 when she met Black Paul, and he was in his 40s, and she had 10 kids. I often wondered, how come I never met my grandfather? Well, he was born in 1860. And I reflect on that because the way I look at it, he was a free man living on Algonquin territory. That was before the Indian Act of 1876 and actually before the establishment of the Golden Lake Indian Reserve of 1873. So just a little tidbit there. So she was 19, he was 37, and their meeting would transform both their lives. So Anna Herriot was a strong-willed, independent woman who challenged Grey Owl's trapping lifestyle. She did convince him to stop killing animals for fur and instead become a champion for their protection. Together they lived in the wilderness, raising orphan beavers and advocating for the preservation of Canada's natural environment. Grey Owl wrote extensively about their life together, and his books, Pilgrims of the Wild, The Men of the Last Frontier, and Tales of an Empty Cabin, became bestsellers in the 1930s. He toured Britain extensively, giving lectures and captivating audiences, including members of the royal family. Anna Herriot was not merely Grey Owl's wife, she was his partner and in many ways his moral compass. She was a vital force in the transformation from trapper to conservationist. Their relationship was complex, passionate, and at times turbulent, but it was also deeply influential in shaping early environmental consciousness in Canada and beyond. After Grey Owl's death in 1938, it was revealed that he was not Indigenous, but an Englishman who had adopted Indigenous identity. So that revelation was scandalous at the time, yet it did not entirely diminish his conservation legacy. A Canadian stamp of Delaney was issued on April the 13th, 2026, and that was certainly a testament to his popularity. Anna Herriot continued to live according to the values they had shared, remaining an advocate for wildlife and Indigenous rights until her death in 1986. So their story, like mine, is one of bridging cultures, challenging conventions, and finding common ground in love and shared purpose. It's a reminder that identity is complex, that heritage is layered, and that the bonds that we form across cultural divides can be powerful forces of change. And I also did meet a granddaughter of Archibald and Anna Herriot. Her name is Carol Crow, and she's a Facebook friend of mine, so she could obviously elaborate a little bit more on their history as well. Just thought I'd mention that. So carrying forward two legacies. As you know, I'm half Algonquin and Scottish, and those legacies involve embracing the richness of both cultures and navigating the complexities of their intertwined histories, and actively working to preserve traditions, languages, and stories for future generations. The histories of the Algonquin Nation and Scotland are deeply entwined due to the European settlement in North America. This has led to complex legacy of shared history, intermarriage, and sometimes conflict. Personal stories are powerful tools for preservation and education, and everybody here obviously has one of their own. Sharing experiences hopefully helps others to understand the complexities and richness of dual identity. So my heritage is a tapestry woven from the hills of Scotland and the forests of Algonquin territory. It's a story of divorce, orphanages, land armies, of war and reunion, of discrimination faced and resilience shown. It's the story of my mother, Wilhelmina, who crossed an ocean for love, of my father, Leo, who served his country and found his heart in the Highlands, and of Arthur, who stood beside my mother in her later years. It's also a story of countless others, like Grey Owl and Anna Herriot, who dared to love across boundaries, and in doing so created new narratives that challenged the status quo and enriched the cultural fabric of both the British Isles and Canada. So I do carry both worlds within me, and I am proud of that journey that brought them together. So my time in Scotland, I'm certainly extremely fortunate to know both my parents. As you know, some people certainly are not, whether, you know, for circumstances you know, that they couldn't explain, you know, adoption, maybe their parents died. So when I was in Scotland, I was a funeral director for 10 years and an embalmer. I know that's a different occupation, but it certainly was a rewarding career that I chose after my military service. And the funeral director commitment to service represents one of humanity's oldest and most honored vocations, and ensuring that the lives of every person, regardless of their circumstance, receives a dignified farewell, and that those left behind have the space to support, grieve, and remember, and eventually find their way forward. So I served as the Scottish Regional Director for the British Institute of Funeral Directors for 5 years until my return to Canada, and that is then another story. On to something a little cheerier. So, the connections between Indigenous Canadians and Scotland extend back centuries and include fascinating stories that are often overlooked in mainstream historical narratives. Today, there are Indigenous Canadians who maintain active connection to Scotland through family genealogy, cultural exchange, and academic collaboration. Some have traced their ancestry to specific Scottish clans and participate in the Highland Games and cultural festivities. When I did move to Scotland in 2013, there was actually a documentary about a community in Scotland, and I can't remember exactly where it was, but there was a group of about 30 Indigenous people who were actually brought over from Canada, you know, back in the early 1800s, and they did establish a community of their own in Scotland. So there's actually, you know, some of our relatives living in Scotland. And it was about 4 years ago now. There was a lady that came to Canada, actually. I got a text message from somebody at Pikwakanagan to say there's a lady, her name is Amanda Beaucamp, she's looking for you. So I met up with her at the Sands restaurant on Golden Lake. As it turned out, she was a cousin of mine, cousin of everybody, you know, in the front row here. And then the second row. She, her father was adopted by an English couple, and he moved back to England with her father, and that's where she was born. So she's a direct descendant of Grand Chief Penessy, and of course it follows through the line to us. You know, so it was really so interesting to meet up with Amanda Beaucamp, and she actually came to the first Grand Chief Penessy Day on the 1st of July that we had 3 years ago. So yeah, that little tidbit there. So there's the gang from Scotland. There they are. So my great-grandfather was apparently 6'4", and the tale is that he had to get his shirt specially made because he was so tall and broad. Now, just to mention broad, my mother had the broadest shoulders that you ever did see. You know, the old days when they used to wear those padded jackets? Well, she didn't need any because, you know, she had very, very broad shoulders. And of course, it trickled down into the rest of the family. So he was a member of the Gordon Highlanders and plowman upon retirement. And so he is I unfortunately, I forgot to bring this little bottle of camp coffee. This is a product that they used back in the days. It was created in 1876 to accompany the Gordon Highlanders, which was a British Army infantry regiment, on their campaigns in India, and it allowed them to satisfy their coffee craving while on the road or camping out. And the label, of course, reflecting on this history, the original label showed a kilted soldier enjoying a cup of coffee served to him by a Sikh servant. So the Camp Coffee is a brand that still exists today, but the label has been edited to show that the Scot now enjoying a cup of coffee with his Sikh friend. So when I was in Scotland, I actually bought about 12 bottles of this stuff to bring back to Canada to hand out to the relatives. So when I was going through the grocery store at the register, I mentioned to the clerk at the time, you know, the story. And he goes, "Oh, and who's your grandfather?" This one here, he points out the Indian Sikh person, not the Scottish Highlander, you know. So I thought that was kind of cute. Anyway, I still have a couple of bottles, and I'm sorry I forgot to bring it today. Anyway, so William Barr Mackay, as I mentioned, he was my grandfather, and he was also a member of the Independent Order of Rechabites. Sounds like a dirty word, doesn't it? It was founded in 1835, and what that organization was, it was an organization that promoted total abstinence from alcohol. So he was a complete teetotaler. And as I mentioned, he was a chauffeur to a lord and a greenhouse keeper in his later life. And my Aunt Betty, when I was in Scotland, she had this letter that was written by the Lord, his reference letter, and it specifically stated, "This man is sober." And she was very proud of that, as you should be. So he lived in Blackness, Scotland, or you could, I guess you could pronounce it Blackness, but it was Blackness, emphasis on the ness, which basically means lake. With his mistress, the scullery maid, Isabella Brodie, which he later married, and he was buried in the Edinburgh Cemetery. So I guess I didn't tell that skeleton in the closet, but I will after I explain who my grandmother is. So my granny was Margaret Aiken Marshall, and she was the mother of 5 children, Margaret, James, Annie, Betty, and my mother, Wilhelmina. So the scandal about Bella is that, unfortunately, my grandfather, although he was a Rechabite, he was a philanderer, and he took up with the scullery maid. And my grandmother, of course, was, you know, with all her, she was carrying my mother at the time, which must have been very shocking, to, you know, to find out that your husband is having an affair with the scullery maid. And one of the daughters, little Annie, apparently Aunt Betty and Annie were playing with matches, and her little nightie caught on fire. And she was severely burned, and she died later of pneumonia when she was in the hospital. So because that obviously was traumatic for my grandmother, she's pregnant, and after the pregnancy, she had postpartum depression. She was probably depressed because her husband was, you know, making up with another woman. So in those days, the man could actually commit the woman to an asylum, you know, for various reasons. They called it hysteria. Well, who wouldn't be hysteric, you know, after all that happening to you? So he put her in an asylum for 2 years, and that's the reason why that my mother, her sister, were taken to the Dean Orphanage, and Uncle James was placed in the workhouse. And my mother told me that she was 17 years old when she saw her mother again, and only once. And that was at the Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh, where they shared a lunch together. So if that's not a really sad story, eh? If that's not a really sad story. But anyway, apparently my grandmother did visit Aunt Betty and her children throughout her life until her death. So at least she did have some happy years with her, you know, one of her daughters and her children. And she did end up marrying another Scotsman, and his last name was MacDonald. And I can't remember if it was Duncan or, you know, some other Scottish name. But anyway, the last name was MacDonald. So now we're coming into the Algonquin ancestors. So as I mentioned, Black Paul was my grandfather. He was born on the 24th of March in 1860 in Oka, or the Lake of Two Mountains. Now, he might not necessarily have been born there, but he was recorded there because the missionaries there, or the Sulpician ministers, recorded all births, deaths, and marriages. So there's a complete detail of my family tree, which is your family tree, that I can share with you later. And he did die on the 12th of November in 1931 here in Pembroke, and he was the son of Jack Kajia. And as I mentioned, I've got all that information that I'm certainly willing to share. So the Jocko name derives from the first name of Jacques, which is a French name. It's spelled Jocko. It can be spelled Jacko, 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 Jacco, Jacot, or even Jacob. So if you see those Indigenous names, they're all related to the same family. So as was common practice amongst Algonquin people, Indigenous last names were changed to anglicize those that individuals took their father's first name as their last name. So within the Algonquin community, there were two prominent Jocko families in Golden Lake and Renfrew area dating back to 1860 and onwards. So these two families came from the descendants and ancestors of Jacques, and I can't pronounce the last name, Kameshawabinishich and Jack Kajia. So descendants of these two men migrated to the Mattawa area, where another Jocko family also resided, and that of Francois Jocko. So Mary Jane LaValle, I know some people say LaValle, we say LaValle. She was born June the 16th in 1893 in Radcliffe, Ontario, which, as I understand, is around Combermere. So she was recorded, and she could have been, on the lake someplace, but, they recorded her birth in Radcliffe. And then she died in 1974 in Madawaska, Ontario. She was a hide tanner and a healer, and she did cure my dad of rheumatic fever twice when he was a child. And I also remember seeing her when I was 4 years old, and I was deathly afraid of her because she had long black hair with speckled of gray. And unfortunately, to me, she looked like a witch. And I do remember I was just screaming my head off when she came near me. And, it was such a shame because she just wanted to obviously love me. And she silently just walked away. So she also married Red Paul, who was the nephew of Black Paul. So that's how our families connect, which is quite close. And so I am also the great-grandchild times 6 of Grand Chief Pierre Louis Constant Penessy, and he's the son of Chief Wembalac, and he was born roughly about 1768, and he died on the 14th of August, 1834, during the cholera epidemic, and he was honored with the title of Grand Chief by the then Governor General Kempt. He also fought in the War of 1812 with his 4 sons. He's buried at the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary churchyard located in Oka, Quebec. And recently, as of 2 weeks ago, I paddled from the Museum of History in Ottawa all the way to Oka in Quebec. When we arrived there, it took us I think it was about a 35-kilometer day. But anyway, when we went to Oka, the waters were completely calm, totally calm. When we arrived, it was raining. Fish were jumping out of the water. A duck came and landed between the canoes. The clergy at the Catholic Church, they rang the bells for 15 minutes upon our arrival. And it was really quite remarkable. The mayor was there to greet us. And we went over to the cemetery where the mayor and the church clergy had erected a memorial sign of the Mohawk, Algonquin, and Nipissing warriors who are actually buried at the cemetery. And when you look at our family tree, all the ancestors from the 3rd great-grandparents back, they're actually all buried in Oka. So that's where a lot of our relatives are buried, just for your information. So it was really quite an emotional arrival. And because it was raining so hard, they actually let us sleep in the church. So I slept under the Virgin Mary. Some people slept under the altar, which was quite interesting. And the one priest actually gave me his crucifix as a gift, which I thought was quite special because we were actually raised Catholic. Just so you know, a lot of Indigenous people were of the Catholic persuasion. So I belong to an organization called Kitchissippi Trails, of which I am the president. We have a 5-year plan of these little canoe expeditions. And what we basically do is just explore, ancient trails and Indigenous trails, voyageur trails, and just, seeking education and information of Algonquin territory here in Ontario and Eastern Quebec. So that's what we do. So the Canadian government implemented formal policies to regulate and discourage intermarriage. The Indian Act was a key mechanism, notably the former Section 12(1), paragraph B of the Indian Act stipulated that an Indigenous woman who married a non-Indigenous man would lose her Indian status, as would her children. And I know that people in this room, including myself, are under that category. Conversely, a non-Indigenous woman who married an Indigenous man would gain her status. So this would be the situation of my mother, because my mother, although she was Scottish, married my father, she actually would gain status as an Indian person. So this gender-based discrimination was designed to regulate racial boundaries and assimilation. And this specific inequity was not fully amended until Bill C-31 in 1985, and further amendments in 2017. There's also a new bill that is on the Senate, which is currently under review, and that's to do with legislation that seeks to eliminate sex-based discrimination entirely and remove the second generation cutoff rule. And I know it's kind of complicated to understand that, but thousands of people with legitimate Indigenous ancestry, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who were denied status because of these discriminatory policies would finally be recognized. So I'll give you an example. I married out. I married a fellow from Nova Scotia who was Irish, and I had 2 children, and they were born 1983 and 1985. So that was just before this amendment. Once the amendment came out, I was entitled then to gain my status back. So my first 2 children also got status, and they were classified as what they call 6-1. So they're classified as full-blood Algonquin people because of the fact it's from my father's line then to me. My 2 other children were born in the 1990s, so 1992 and 94, and they were given the category 6-2. So that too puts them under that second generation cutoff, you see, so they cannot pass their status to their children. But my older 2 children can. Even though my daughter has 2 little kids, to a non-Indigenous man, they're classified as Indians, and they're white as snow. You know what I mean? And then my other son, he did marry an Indigenous lady, and so, of course, that keeps the Indigenous line going. But for Marshall and Davis, who are quite entitled to whoever they marry, their children should have the same status as their older brother and sister, but they do not at this moment. So Bill S2 hopefully will rectify that situation. So the legacy of Indigenous peoples and European heritage is a complex and intertwined history marked by initial encounters, true trade alliances, and diplomacy, but fundamentally shaped by the profound and lasting impact of European colonialism, which led to displacement, cultural suppression, and intergenerational trauma for Indigenous communities. So despite these immense challenges, Indigenous cultures have shown remarkable resilience and continue to thrive and contribute to modern society. I love this photo. And this photo shows recruits from the File Hills colony in Saskatchewan posing with Chief Day Walker, Jack Fisher, Feather, and he's the one with the horn headdress, Pimotat, Kiwisk, elders, family members, and a representative from the Department of Indian Affairs before departing for the train during World War I. So my cousin Devon Aird and his wife Valerie is the granddaughter of the elder and soldier Ernest Goforth, shown in this photo, and the great-granddaughter of Feather, and Feather is the one with the horned headdress. So to me, that's really a special photo, and if you didn't know that before, you know it now. So his great-granddaughter, Leanne O'Brien, is currently the Deputy Chief of Police for the Akwesasne Police Services, and that is just a point of interest. So this fella here, John Norton, is a famous figure in history, embodied the complex cultural intersection that defined the War of 1812. John Norton's life reads like a family history puzzle that spans the Atlantic. As a child of a Scottish woman and a Cherokee man, raised in a moving world of soldiers, ports, and trade routes that link Britain and the Caribbean and North America. So those imperial circuits created unlikely meetings and marriages. And Norton's own origins remind us that British Isles ancestry often connects wider stories of migration, service, and colonial entanglement. Norton later entered the Haudenosaunee or Six Nation territory political life through the adoption by Chief Joseph Brant, or Tyendinaga, you may have heard that name, receiving the Mohawk name of the Open Door, and I'm not going to pronounce his Mohawk name because I don't want to ruin it. So that name captures what made him historically distinctive. He could speak across worlds. His Scottish upbringing helped him navigate the British language and military culture, while his Indigenous lineage and relationships grounded him in kinship, obligations, and diplomacy. In the War of 1812, that dual identity was not a curiosity, but a working set of skills that helped to coordinate alliances, interpret intentions, and advocate for Indigenous sovereignty in a time when the future of communities and lands were being contested. Now, as I mentioned, Grand Chief Constant Penesse and his 4 sons also fought in the War of 1812, specifically at the Battle of the Beaver Dams, and more likely as well at the Battle of Queenston Heights. Now then, because they were not able to read or write English, the person with those skills, of course, has the narrative, which was John Norton, right? So he wrote more about the Mohawk Six Nations being involved in the War of 1812 rather than the Algonquins. But if you look back in history, you'll see that a large contingent of Mohawk and Algonquin warriors from Kanesatake and Kahnawake accompanied the British to Queenston Heights and the Beaver Dam. So just as a point of interest. And I know you're historians, so you might already know that or have another story. But I guess the story here for everyone, you should be proud of your heritage, whether it's Indigenous, European, or any other background. So that concludes my presentation for this morning. So if you want to ask any questions, please do so.
Hey,
Are there any questions from the audience? I'm going to be here because I have a mic on and it'll be heard on the video. Yes, questions?
I don't have a question, but I just want to thank you, Wendy. That was such a fascinating story. You had such a lively history behind you.
Yeah, well, that's not all of it in half an hour. What can you say, right? Or no.
Stories that maybe somebody can't share, but it was wonderful. And even though we may not have had a large group here, we will have it on our YouTube channel. So I'm hoping that more people will be able to hear your story and appreciate your heritage.
Well, thank you so much. If you're ever in Algonquin Park, there's a book at the Visitor Center. It's called Joe Valley and the Paleface. So just so you know, Joe Valley is my grandmother's brother. He was also in the war. And that story is about a British soldier who happened to find himself at a train station picking up a flyer advertising Algonquin Park and the wild. And so he traveled to Algonquin Park and hired an Indigenous guide who happened to be Joe Valley. And the paleface, of course, is the British soldier. So if you're interested, you know, that'll tell you a little bit about that story. And there's another book that has recently come out by Dr. Lynn Gale. She is also a relative, and her great grandmother is my grandfather's sister. But it's the story of Joseph Gagne, who joined World War I and basically was enfranchised, and tells the plight of Indigenous people when they joined the military. They basically lost their Indian status. Or if you were a doctor, a lawyer, or wanted to be an educated person, you were basically stripped of your identity. But this is a story that she tells of her great-grandfather, Joseph Gagne. And I remember my mom talking about visiting here in Pembroke to their family, you know. So I love history. I like family connections, and you know, I really appreciate being asked to come and speak about my Indigenous and Scottish background. So thank you.
Question.
You just
Sorry.
briefly mentioned about your military. Did you want to mention anything else about that? Like, did you say 10 years in the military?
23.
Oh, 23.
23.
23 years,
Yeah.
yeah. And I didn't know actually when I was young that both my parents were in the military, that they, you know, served in World War II. But we lived in Petawawa at the time, and remember I was only 4 years old. I was being returned after being placed with my relatives up in Whitney. There was a house fire, so I had to go live up there for a while. Then I came back, and if you've ever been to Petawawa, there's a Tim Hortons. Then there's a store across the road. Well, there used to be a little pink house. That's where we lived. And I remember seeing a soldier coming out of the store. He had the old khaki grays with the puttees on. He must have bought himself a pack of cigarettes. And I thought, oh my gosh, look at that guy. You know, he impressed me so much. So I decided on my little tricycle, there I was looking at him. I said, that's what I'm going to do one day. And so we were living in Toronto. At the time, I was going to school at East York Collegiate, which is on Coxwell Avenue. And there was a big recruiting campaign going on. That was 1977. There was a sergeant from the recruiting center that came in, giving us a pep talk. And I thought, oh, that's it. I'm joining. So I said to my mom, I want to join the Army. But because I was so young, she had to sign the papers. That's when I found out that she was in the Scottish Women's Land Army and that my dad was in the military. So when I told my dad what I was doing, he goes, oh, that's the best decision you ever made. So, and it was, you know, but, you know, being in the military, and that's another segment altogether. But for me, I enjoyed the military, certain aspects, but, you know, within the military, of course, there was discrimination and racism involved there. But because of the fact, I thank my father for it, he was the type of a man that never drew attention to the fact that I was a girl. He used to take me hunting. He used to take me fishing. When he placed a .22 in my hands, I thought, what's he doing, right? Like, he was going to trust me with this thing? You know what I mean? So he never made me feel inadequate about being a woman. And I just felt I'm sticking it out in the military against all odds. If they didn't like me, you're going to see me every day with a smile. So, yeah, that's
Another question here.
Were you there at the same time?
what year were you there?
Well, I was born in Pembroke, and
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, yes, we were. You're not talking about the military career. I remember going to visit your mom and dad. in Petawawa, distinctly, and we used to go and visit you on the base. And this is so vivid in my memory. There was a little bird walking up the road and a car ran over it. Like, how traumatizing, but a baby bird, learning how to fly and run over by a vehicle. But yes, we used to go and visit you all the time. So you know what? It's too bad you can't remember from your childhood, right? Certain segments are there. Obviously, that was traumatic. That's why I remember it.
You had mentioned a Black Indigenous person, Dave Jocko, who was your grandfather's brother. He claimed himself as a Black Indian.
Now,
Word at the time.
okay, but were they part Black? Because here's the thing. A couple of months ago, I was invited to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Gala. I happened to be sitting next to the former Governor General, Michel Jean, who is Black. We got to talking and I showed her a picture of my grandfather and she goes, oh yeah, he's Black. Like if I show you a picture of Black Paul, you would think he was Black. And his sons all had extremely dark skin and not curly hair, but like nice black, jet black, wavy hair. So I'd be interested to get my DNA done to see maybe there is, Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's another story, right? The, what do you call it there? Mrs. Tubman, the underground, she brought Black people up to Canada. So we never know. And I met another girl, she's Algonquin and she is half Black. And visually, you don't see the Black, you only see the Indigenous. Are we running late?
Oh, no, I just put you back on the screen.
Oh. Yeah, so that's very interesting. But I know where Red Paul comes into the equation. Red Paul's mother was Scottish, you see, and he was so proud. He used to carry her obituary in his wallet because she died at the old age of 104, or maybe even older. She lived a very long life. So he had actually reddish tinge to him, with the beard and whatnot. Yeah, so that's where the red comes in. Yeah.
I don't know how Shook was related to us, but Shook lived up Fallen Road out towards Lutheran Camp. But he was very dark. I remember him. He's like almost like a leather skin on him.
Yeah, yeah.
Tracker, so.
Yeah.
Any other questions, comments?
You also mentioned Carol Crow.
Carol, yeah.
Yeah. Her father was Burden Nelson.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
So
you've got to
he
connect.
is definitely not related to Anna Harriot, because we're not related to Anna Harriot.
No.
No. And Carol Crow is not related. That's just, I know that for a fact. Yeah.
So, okay, where's everybody from in this room? You know my story. You got German.
Yes. It's interesting. I mean, I was listening to your story and realizing our paths never crossed, but our history. We spent time in Scotland.
Okay.
We have a cottage and have a family cottage at Golden Lakes. We've been we went to the Catholic Church on the reservation for years.
Mm-hmm.
We also my wife has a relative in the Oka Cemetery that we went to visit this past year.
Interesting.
So there's a lot of connections back and forth, even though we've never met before.
Yeah, you just don't know, right? You just don't know who you're going to meet. And ironically enough, when Chief Kirby was the chief, we used to go, on these road trips to meet our membership and give them updates. And we were in Kingston. There was a guy sitting in the audience. His name's Dave Jocko. And he came over to me to introduce himself. And this is the son of the first family of Black Paul, like the grandson. So that's how I connected with them. Yeah. So I often wondered where those children were, and I found them. And then there's another girl who I'm friends with on Facebook. Her name is Victoria Jocko. And I just shared the Jocko family tree with her. Now, one of the children of the first family, there was George and another little fellow who unfortunately passed away, but George went to the States, so maybe that's his grandchild,
Mhm.
you know? So, yeah, I just really like family connections and history. It's so interesting. Yeah.
It's been a very captivating presentation, Wendy, and I wanted to thank you greatly for taking the time to do this. You had a busy schedule yesterday.
Yes.
And somebody woke you up in the middle of
Middle
your
of-
middle of your evening to say, just to remind you that we're here today. Here's a little thank you.
Thank
and
you.
I wish you all the best in your future career as you keep moving on.
Yes,
Right.
thank you so much.
And did the dead bird ever have anything to do with you becoming a funeral director?
You never know.
It left a lasting impression.
Yeah.
It did. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much for a
Thank
lovely
you.
presentation.